Over the decades, the HO scale market has seen a lot of different models that can be counted in the affordable mid-range area, and many of these you can very easily find in the $30 to $60 range. Some are better than others, and all are really pretty decent, so in this video I thought I'd go over some of them. To start off, let's look at the Mahano GP18. So this one was sold under the Bachmann name, although Mahano's products are most commonly found under the AHM and IHC brands. You also find them from Model Power, Lifelike, and maybe even a couple others. So Mahano's been around for a long time, and they make some decent quality products, although the detail will usually be less than what you find on other models. So these are really made more to be good runners than anything. They're inexpensive products, and a lot of times you can have a whole fleet of smooth running diesels or even some steam engines for about the cost of a single high-end model from another manufacturer. Taking a closer look at the details, you can see that pretty much everything is molded directly on, and in the case of diesels like this one, even the handrails are molded directly on as part of the walkway. So this gives them a bit of a chunkier and more toy-like appearance, and if there's any damage to them, which is more common on these because the material is weaker than what you'll find on other handrails, they can be kind of difficult to repair, especially in a way that looks good. Some of their models will actually have some see-through ventilation molded on in some areas. This one doesn't, but for the ones that do, it's a nice effect. Paint quality, it's at least decent. The printing is good. The paint separation for different colors is all right. It's not always the best, but they're rarely ever the worst either. Some areas like the fuel tank, they almost never put any effort into that. So like you can see here, those two air tanks are actually just little round caps molded onto a box. Trucks will usually look all right though. Only a few of their models have had poorer detailing on the trucks, like the C-Liner and BL2. And then looking at the end, on most of their diesels you're going to get truck mounted couplers, so big open pilot with no detail inside. Some of them have had body mounted couplers, but this is what you're going to find in most cases. What you're really getting these for more than anything is their running quality and value. So most Mahano diesels, aside from some of the old units like the C-Liner and BL2, and their really cheap small switchers with 4 wheels, you're pretty much always going to get all-wheel or at least 8-wheel drive with a centrally mounted motor. And that's going to be a 3-pole motor, although later ones from IHC have a skewed armature to improve low-speed operation. This one does not have the skewed armature, so it tends to take a bit of voltage to start, and then low speed control isn't great. Also, the electrical pickup can vary between 4 wheels or sometimes 8 wheels. This one has 8-wheel electrical pickup, so it's more reliable going around the track. You can see that this is a very nice and smooth runner. I've rarely ever gotten a bad unit from Mahano. They also have at least a decent amount of weight, so they can pull a realistic load of freight cars behind them. Now let's look at the Rivarossi. So these were most often imported by AHM through the 60s and 70s, a few by IHC in the 80s, I believe, although most of them beyond that have been sold under the Rivarossi name. So Rivarossi's details, aside from some of their very early ones, have always been very good. The molding on the shells is very sharp. They're good with the 3-dimensional details. The painting is clear, sharp, and looks great. For the running quality though, these tend to be more hit and miss. Their mechanisms weren't always the best, like the E8 here. It has a 4-wheel drive mechanism with 2 traction tires, so only these rear 2 axles are geared. And that of course cuts electrical pickup down, so it's only 6-wheel pickup, 3 wheels in each truck. Not always super reliable. but not the worst I've seen either. Looking closer up, well, first of all, you can ignore those grab irons. Those were an early detailing experiment of mine. But you can see that the shape of the nose on this one is very nice, very smooth. They were really good at seamless molding on their plastic parts. The window glass is nice and flush with the surface, which is something that I've rarely seen even from some of the most modern manufacturers. So definitely good job there. Truck detail is nice and deep, looks great. And one little thing that you'll find on most Rivarossis, just because of European standards instead of American manufacturing standards, is the larger flanges, so they don't look quite so realistic, and they'll have trouble running over anything but code 100 track. But also getting up closer to the paint, this model is probably about 50 years old, and yet that's really, I'd say, ahead of its time for its sharpness and quality. So if nothing else, you're going to get a nice looking model when you buy a Rivarossi. Now getting onto the running quality, this one here is the most common version. It has their 3-pole flat can motor right here. The earliest units had a very thin square motor, which was an alright runner, but not very powerful. And then late models, which also have the thinner RP25 flanges, and there aren't really many of those around, those actually use a Mahano 3-pole motor, so they're quieter, not really any smoother, but they are all really decent runners, I'd say. So let's get that going. Doesn't exactly have good low speed performance just because of the gearing and that motor. It is pretty quiet though, even with the metal gears in this one. It's steel worm and all brass gearing, so it's going to be pretty reliable. For its time, it's a quiet runner. Definitely not as quiet as your modern diesels that you can get now, but not bad. It does run very fast though. I've calculated this to be about 130 scale miles per hour. There's a little bit of a wobble there just because of the traction tires. So some will run smoother than others, and some will have a pretty bad wobble. Sometimes you can actually take the cover plate off of the rear truck and rotate one of the axles on its own, maybe a quarter or half turn, and off-balance tires can sort of counter each other and get rid of some of the wobble. Now let's look at the Walthers Trainline GP9M here. So this is one of the few HO scale models that you can still find brand new for around $60 or maybe even a little less than $60 in some places. So it's really not a bad deal at all. You get a smooth running all-wheel drive mechanism with a can motor and small flywheel. It's got plenty of weight. It does use an old shell though. I believe this one was developed by a company called Cox in the late 60s, early 70s. For details, well, again, this is one that I added a few extra grab irons to it, just in an early detailing project. But you'll find very few details on these, maybe just a couple horns, and the handrails, which are thin, nicely scaled at least, and flexible enough that they're not going to break easily. The painting, it's not bad. It's a little fuzzy around the edges, but the printing is nice and clear, and the color looks good. Now, since this one uses an old shell, the body is too wide. It's above scale width because it was based on the Athearn body, or basically copied from it in a lot of areas. Some other Trainline models were actually developed new, like the Dash 8 40B and F40PH, so those are better scaled. But the other ones, like the GP9M here and the FA1, those are made using old shells, which look all right, but they're not the best. Now for performance, these use very quiet nylon gears and I think a Mabuchi can motor with a small flywheel that's not really big enough to do much. And you get all-wheel drive and electrical pickup, so it's going to be dependable. And the motor does have a skewed armature, so speed control isn't bad. They did, however, go with a high-speed gearing and slow-speed motor to compensate, so it can't quite crawl, but it doesn't do bad, honestly. It also means it's going to have a bit less torque for pulling because it's putting more strain on the motor by having that high-speed gearing. The motor does have enough torque, though, that it does pretty well overall with pulling. It's a fairly quiet runner, nice and smooth, very steady. And they actually fill pretty much the whole inside here with a big metal weight, so you're going to get plenty of traction out of these. And now let's move on to Bachmann's standard line. Some of them have come from old Spectrum models like the H1644. Others, like the FTA here, these use old shells that were developed all the way back in the 70s and aren't exactly the best for detail. In fact, the truck style and spacing here is completely incorrect for the FT. It's actually an F7 chassis, F9 chassis. The body itself, it doesn't look too bad. Detail's all right with the molded on parts. Windows are a little too thin. The paint, it looks good, although they got the stripe in the wrong area here. It's supposed to go all the way back past the second porthole for the war bonnet. But for a cheap model, I think most people will be able to overlook that. So these standard line models, they of course used to have the 3-pole pancake motor like in the like the ones I showed in the video for the cheap diesels. But for the past 20 years or so, they've been including an all-wheel drive mechanism on a metal chassis. So it's got a good amount of weight. Some standard line models aren't very heavy, but they still have a metal chassis and enough weight to pull a decent amount. And they'll have a CAN motor, all-wheel electrical pickup. Some have flywheels, some don't. And when you get these from a train set, they're more likely to have a 3-pole, maybe Mabuchi CAN motor in them, which is just fine. But then some others that have been separate models, like this one here, wasn't from a train set, has one of Bachmann's 5-pole motors, which is the same as what you'll find in some of the Spectrum models, so they run pretty nicely. Getting up close again so you can see more of the detail. The paint is nice and smooth. There's some fuzzy areas in the separation and line work. The trucks, Bachmann's been making some really nice looking ones since the 80s, so you really aren't going to find much better detail than this on these style of diesel trucks, so those look great. Body, not exactly the best one here again, but it doesn't look bad. And some of the new tooling models are much sharper and look very nice. So you're going to get a decent looking model from them. Now let's have a look at the running quality. Takes off nice and smooth. It's quiet. It's a steady runner. And again, this is one of the ones that came outside of a train set and was sold with a 5-pole motor. So it's a smooth, powerful, and efficient runner. And with the heavy chassis that they used in these, it's got plenty of pulling power. So even if this one in particular isn't the most realistic model, you're at least going to get a very smooth and reliable runner from them. And low speed control isn't bad either. It can crawl pretty decently, I'd say. And now next up is Roco. So these were most often sold under the Atlas name, the American models anyway. And most recently, these have been sold by Concor instead. But the manufacturing of them has been pretty much the same from the very beginning. Later ones will have a better motor, sometimes even the same motor that you'll find in Athearn's Genesis diesels. So those are very nice. But even early on, these units from the 70s that were sold by Atlas were especially well regarded for their running qualities. They've got all-wheel drive, a very sturdy chassis with a very dependable gearing, I even remember reading some old model railroader magazines where they did projects by taking the trucks off of a Roco chassis and putting them onto an Athearn chassis to make them run that much smoother. Their motors are 5-pole, very good for their day. They come with flywheels. And the detail, it's pretty nice. They're good looking models. The hood units that have the handrails, they used a good quality, I believe, nylon material that's very, very hard to break. So they're easy to handle, and just overall some very nice quality models. And now getting in close on the details, I think really Roco's only weak point, at least on their early models, was in their paint quality. Like right there, you can see they just used a really cheap water slide decal on the front and didn't even use any sort of setting solution to make it settle down properly, so it really doesn't look that good. On this one though, the paint itself is actually pretty well done compared to what I've seen on some of the other ones. Like I have an SD24 from them where it almost looks like they just took a spray gun to make the line like that instead of using any sort of stencil, so it's a very, very fuzzy color separation. Beyond that though, you can see that the quality of the molding is very nice. Very few seams around, and the ones that are there are thin. Most of the details are molded on, of course. And then on some of their units like the SD24, in fact most of the diesels, aside from the FP7 here, have this odd wide split right in the center of the fuel tank. I think that was to help with inserting screwdrivers for getting the body off, but it made it look kind of weird on the outside. Beyond that though, these are very nice looking models, well detailed for their day. Now getting onto the running quality. All of these units have a solid metal chassis. Most of them have additional weights inside. This one doesn't have additional weights just because they were able to fill the entire body up to the sides and then just slip the motor down in. This is actually probably one of the earliest examples of the modern F-unit chassis. You get all-wheel drive, a large 5-pole motor with flywheel, all-wheel electrical pickup. So these were known to be very strong, very reliable runners. Flywheel in this one isn't perfectly balanced, so it makes just a slight rumble while it's going down the track, which you might be able to hear. Pretty quiet overall though. The 6-axle drives were noisier than these. They didn't get the gear mesh quite as good. But 4-axle units like this one, very good, very quiet runners for their day. And they really are built to last. So you buy one of these, you know it's going to run for a long time. And they need very little maintenance too, just a tiny bit of oil here and there now and then. They'll basically run forever. And now last up for this video is the Athearn Blue Box Diesel Kit. From the very beginning, these have always been very well regarded for their quality and dependability. Even though some of the early models weren't so good as far as detail goes, you're always going to get a metal chassis, an all-wheel drive, and a 5-pole motor. So they were very well known for being basically the bulletproof models that are the workhorses of any layout, because they really are built to last, and with minimal maintenance they'll run basically forever. Most Blue Box kits include metal handrails, so that makes them easy to handle without damaging, although it does require a little extra assembly work because the stanchions are separate from the actual wire railing, and on early models especially this could be a bit tedious to put together because you actually had to originally bend the tops of these stanchions over yourself. It wasn't long before they started to do that for the modeler though, so it got a lot easier to assemble these sometime in the mid-60s, I'd say. The trucks on their early models, most of them had all metal side frames and some extra weight, but they switched to plastic in the 80s which really didn't cause any quality issues. In fact, it made for sharper molding and better looking models. And most of them have the sintered iron wheels there instead of the usual brass or nickel. So they're very long lasting. At the same time though, the wheels are really one of the points that require more maintenance than what you might get with other models, because the material is a little more porous than your usual brass, so it's going to collect more dirt over time. And then looking at the paint quality, getting in close, you can see that this one has very, very sharp and smooth paint quality. So it's really about as good as you can get in the affordable price range. Athearn just really made some great looking models over the years. And now on to the running quality. Again, this has an all-metal chassis, all-wheel drive, 5-pole motor, and larger diesels like this have 2 very large flywheels in them that really help a lot with coasting. So you kind of have to plan for that sometimes when you're making stops, because it can keep on going for quite a long time before it'll finally stop. Early models didn't have any flywheels, so you didn't have to worry about that, of course. And starting in the 60s, well, starting with the rubber band drives, they had all-wheel electrical pickup, and then the geared chassis also got all-wheel electrical pickup sometime in the 60s, so it's going to be dependable in that area. It can take a little more voltage to start these sometimes, just because of the way that the motor's designed. Athearns often had a distinctive growl to them. Some of it was from the gears, some of it could come from the universals, which have a tendency to vibrate because they're usually made from about 5 pieces, at least up until the late models that use the hex coupling. Now, the motors in these, except for, I'd say, starting with the Dash 9s in the late 80s, or, well, I guess that would actually be the early mid-90s, they didn't have the highest torque, so these can get bogged down a little more easily by a heavy load. But as long as you're keeping these to a realistic load, so maybe you could say about 20 free-rolling cars per motor, you're not going to see many problems at all. And even if you do load them down a bit more, Athearn's motor design is about half open frame, so they manage to stay cool and run for a very, very long time. So to finish off here, just for my personal ratings, I'd have to start by putting Rivarossi at the lowest point. Even though they're nicely detailed, the mechanical quality can be inconsistent, so some are good, some are not so good. They can usually be tuned up though if you know what you're doing. And then next up would be Mahano. Smooth runners, but not exactly the best looking, sometimes even chunky toy-like detail, but you're going to get a good, decent runner out of it. Then after that comes Walther's Trainline. Very good, basic models. Again, not always the best looking, but you're going to get a nice runner, dependable model. Then after that comes Bachmann. Again, very smooth runners. Not always the best looking though, pretty inconsistent with the shells in the standard line just because of the mix of old and new. And there have been some over the years that have had issues with split gears, but most of the time these days it's really a non-issue. After that comes Roco, or early Atlas, and Concours. Very good models, smooth, dependable, and powerful runners. They look good, they're just a little bit lacking in the paint quality in some areas, and of course they're going to be older, at least the ones from Atlas. These haven't been made since the early 80s, mid 80s or so, so they're going to be at least 40 years old when you buy an Atlas version. And then last, at the top, I'd say is Athearn Blue Box. You get very good, very dependable models. They're nice looking, they're easy to work on, and they're pretty much going to last forever. So that's going to be it for this video. Anytime that you go out to look for an affordable but nice running model, it's very likely that you're going to run across any one of these options since they are very common. So I hope this video has helped you out with knowing a little more about them so that you can make a more informed decision when you're ready to purchase a new model for your layout.